Hello and welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we bring you stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Today's story is an epic modern-day David and Goliath story about a uranium refinery and a small Mennonite community in Saskatchewan. In the summer of 1976, Eldorado Energy proposed to build a $100 million uranium processing plant at Warman, Saskatchewan. Originally, community members were told that developers were planning to build a shoe factory. When the truth about the uranium refinery came out, residents felt misled. At that time, they learned that the end refinery product, radioactive hexafluoride, was not a product used in any Canadian electricity generating stations. Hexafluoride was meant solely for export. Local residents feared that processing hexafluoride would generate waste material that could remain hazardous for thousands of years, and that it would be exported for use in nuclear weapons. Residents organized the Warman and District Concerned Citizens Group to oppose Eldorado Energy's plans. While Eldorado, the Goliath in this story, had the backing of the federal government, the citizens group, the David character, was made up of volunteers. Ernie Hildebrand was then a recent graduate of Canadian Mennonite Bible College, or CMBC as he refers to it. He had recently become pastor at nearby Osler Mennonite Church. Ernie wondered whether a uranium refinery would pose threats to the safety of residents and the quality of the land, air, and water in the area. To test the issue with his congregation, he presented a sermon entitled A Christian Response to the Nuclear Energy Question. The sermon prompted questions from the church members, and interest in the issue grew. Soon, the wider community learned about the project and the Osler congregation's interest in the topic. They organized into the Warman and District Concerned Citizens Group. At subsequent community meetings, the wider community asked Ernie to chair the Citizens Group, which by now had captured the interest of farmers, townspeople, laborers, and others. By the time the issue was resolved, the Concerned Citizens Group had more than 800 members. In Ernie's memoirs, published in 2021, he recounts the years of advocacy work in a chapter entitled My Life as a Protestor. I reached him by phone at his home near Crystal City, Manitoba, and asked him to share some recollections about that period of his life.
This issue started in 1977. I think it really kind of mushroomed the last year and a half, probably, and we had a lot of energy. You know, we were a prime of life in that sense.
Membership on the executive of the Concerned Citizens Group included representatives from the wider community. Nonetheless, many perceived Ernie Hildebrand and the Osler Mennonite Church as leaders in protesting the refinery.
You know, what is your church going to do with this issue? We know something is happening there. Like, what are you going to do? You know, that was prodding us to get going. And there's the Bergthaler Church. It's not the same as the Bergthaler Church in Manitoba. It is a conservative conference. And I think they had about 1,000 members in there under a bishop. And the bishop went around to all of his family, his whole flock, and he asked them about this issue, where they stood. And they were overwhelmingly opposed to having a refinery in our community.
Local politicians touted the benefits of jobs and the influx of money to build, operate, and maintain the refinery.
The tension in the community was with municipal councilors, mayors of towns, local towns, that Eldorado had contact with and persuaded them that this would be a good thing for the community. And so there were individuals in the town of Warman that were in leadership that were very opposed to what we're doing, and they would battle us.
Eldorado Energy executives invited the community to meetings and forums and encouraged attenders to ask questions. But their inquiry process didn't turn out as well as they had hoped.
We peppered them with questions at this meeting. You know, I remember some of the questions. One of them was, from our group, was, if you claim this refinery is safe, There's no problems with it. Why do you need 9/4 of land as a buffer zone around where the refinery will be built? They said they were open to answer our questions, so we had our questions, and they couldn't answer them. We asked them about the storage of the waste on site because they were going to at first keep it in steel barrels and then eventually bury it. And we asked them, is that safe to do that? This is dairy country. There's wells here. And what do we all know what's happening here? Will it contaminate our well water in our dairy area? And they couldn't really answer those kind of questions. And they came back a month or a couple of months later and said, no, we're going to remove all those waste materials and take them back up north and put them back in the mines. We all of a sudden realized we weren't as uninformed as people maybe thought we were. We had real concerns, and they should have been able to satisfy our concerns.
Eldorado Energy eventually realized they'd need to get buy-in from the Mennonite contingent in the community if their plans were to have even a chance to succeed. In their zeal, they resorted to some questionable tactics, including an attempt to draw Canadian Mennonite Bible School into the debate.
They didn't quite believe that we reflected Mennonite people at large, and so they made overtures to CMBC in Winnipeg and asked questions about Mennonite heritage and theology and approach to government, etc., etc. They wanted a forum, and I think their contact was Harry Huebner. And Harry said, well, we could do that, but we would want to invite representatives from Warman to come as well and sit in on this forum. And they flatly refused to do that.
Osler Mennonite Church passed a resolution to lobby the government for a moratorium on the project, and neighboring churches were supportive. Later, the issue escalated to the Conference of Mennonites in Saskatchewan. However, there were some Mennonite churches who were uncomfortable with Osler's stance.
On the other hand, even in Saskatoon, we had Mennonite churches that were quite opposed and quite alarmed that we were speaking out publicly and voiced their displeasure with us, even though the Saskatchewan Conference also passed resolutions asking the government to reconsider some of their plans on uranium development and refinery issues.
Eldorado Energy had access to what seemed like bottomless funding to advocate for their position. The Concerned Citizens Group relied on volunteers to travel and make presentations. The debate wore on for 4 years. Finally, a local farmer summed up the community's feelings in a tactful way.
One of our senior members, our 70-year-old dairy farmer, said to them, he says, we like you people. We would welcome you to come and move into our communities and live with us. We just don't like your refinery. There's all kinds of experts in these kind of issues, and we realize that we don't have that expertise in terms of scientific knowledge and engineering skills and even, the whole kind of looking into the future, what are energy requirements and how might this, we weren't experts in that, but we decided experts in living within this rural community.
The federal government appointed an independent panel to assess the refinery proposal. The Concerned Citizens asked to appoint their own representative to the panel. That request was denied, but they were permitted to recommend an advisor to the panel.
We submitted a number of names, and they chose David Schrader, a professor from CBC that knows Mennonite history and theology and can very much interpret especially the more conservative aspects of the Mennonite Church. But that was so interesting because the secretary, the contact for the panel that met with us to kind of gear us toward participation, his name was Bob Connolly, and he phoned quite excited one time, talking to one of our executives and saying, we want to tell you that you're the first to know that we have appointed David Schrader to be this person, and we already knew that. Our own linkages had passed that information on to us, And also they realized the interconnectedness of the Mennonite world.
In 1979, Ernie resigned from his position as pastor at Osler Mennonite Church to prepare for public hearings. To make financial ends meet, he and his wife Judy drove a school bus. Ernie took on farm labor jobs, and Judy did some substitute teaching. In January 1980, the government panel began holding public hearings in Saskatoon and the rural town of Martinsville. Ultimately, the panel rejected Eldorado Energy's proposal to locate its uranium refinery at Warman. The concerned citizens' model of calm and civil posture of questioning versus confrontation had paid off. Ernie felt validated by the questioning approach, especially after he heard what transpired at the Saskatoon hearings.
The 2 weeks in Saskatoon were radically different, I was told, than at Martinsville. It was more that people would get up a mic and they would scream and they would berate the things and they would yell and they would be antagonistic. And it was quite unruly. Apparently, when both the panel and the Eldorado officials came back to Martinsville, they were so happy to be back in our midst. Well, that says an awful lot.
When it comes to economic development, Ernie is on the side of environmental stewardship and caution when it could affect people for generations into the future.
I do respect that the nuclear industry is subjected to very, very strict safety standards, but they're also dealing with very, very hazardous substances that have implications well beyond our lifetimes. To decide on something that is going to affect potentially life for tens of thousands of years. We can make decisions that affect our life in the next 5 or 10 years kind of thing, but when we're making it for the next coming generations, and to say that, no, we'll allow this in our community and everything will be fine, and all of a sudden the next generation say, oh, it isn't fine.
In 2022, Osler Mennonite Church invited Ernie to read from his memoirs. The audience was mainly interested in recounting the battle where David triumphed over the Goliath that was Eldorado Energy. Ernie gets emotional in describing the reception he received at the reading.
What was powerful for me was that a pastor who had served a very controversial 5 years in a role in a rural Mennonite congregation under all of that stress that the pastor and the congregation faced was so warmly received back into their midst to relive some of those issues and really, in a sense, celebrated what we as a group had done.
In reliving the Eldorado Energy protests some 50 years later, Ernie had this to say about preserving stories like this one.
If it isn't stored in archives, like this story in particular, in a few more years, there'll be few of us left that had the living experience, and there'll be nobody to interview. So all that is left is what is in the archives, in the records.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. I'm Conrad Stace, the archivist at the MHA. Thanks to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Mennonite Church Canada. This program is made possible through support from Golden West Radio and listeners like you. If you want to support this program and the work of the archives, you can find out how to do that on our website, mharchives.ca, and click on Support.
For this episode on the Warman uranium refinery, Conrad Stace dug out a collection of documents at the MHA and pointed me in the direction of Ernie Hildebrand's book, Guiding Diverse Flocks, Tales of a Mennonite Pastor. Ernie's book is available at commonword.ca and at the Steinbeck Mennonite Heritage Museum. Thank you very much, Ernie, for chatting with me. I'm your host, Dan Dyck. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will return next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for lending me your ears.